Okay, so back again, we'll start over. We're going to talk about composting and gardening today. I'm Patricia Barrett, Miller County Extension Master Gardener Coordinator. And we're going to talk about why composting is good for gardening. This is just a compost bin where somebody has placed their kitchen detritus into a bucket, and what they'll do is they'll follow one of the processes that we're talking about and add this material back into their soil. So what is composting? Well, it's the decomposition of organic materials into an end product known as compost. And grammar police, yes, I know it says no. I had forgot to correct that. I saw it the other day and I'm sorry. Invertebrates, such as insects and earthworms, microorganisms like bacteria and fungi, like my husband, he's a fungi, help in this transformation. And what is it really? Composting is recycling. What we do, and when I talk to my hay school and my grazing school participants, we show them that when they take the hay off the field, they're removing nitrogen, they're removing potassium, they're removing phosphorus. And that's an expensive product because they need to pay to fertilize to add that back in. But when we allow cattle to graze in that field and they graze the grass and poop it back out, right? It adds that nitrogen, it adds that potassium, it adds that phosphorus, it adds the fiber that they just recycled into compost. They made manure into compost is what they did. Now, you can feed them hay and they will poop it out and do the same thing. But this is what we want to do, is we want everybody to understand the manure also is a valuable fertilizer product, as you know. So what is composting? Number one, it's you take organic waste, the microorganisms, the water, the carbon dioxide, and the heat, and the air, turn this organic waste into compost, I should say. And why is it important? Number one, it reduces waste. Number two, it improves soil structure when we add it back into our soil. Number three, it retains moisture. It helps your soil retain moisture. It slows the runoff from the rain. And number four, it reduces your soil's need and your plant's need for fertilizer, because we're adding compost, which has a fertile composition, back to the soil. How do gardeners use compost? Number one, you sprinkle it on top of your flowers and vegetable beds. Number two, you can rake it into your tree beds. Number three, you can blend it with potting soil to revitalize the soil. Number four, you can spread it on top of the soil in your lawn. You can make compost tea. Does anyone do compost tea? You just take a bucket, take your 5-gallon bucket, take a 50-gallon barrel if you choose to, and put compost into that bucket, add water, leave it for a couple days. You can use the brown water that comes from that blending for a couple days, and it is actually very nutrient rich. It's a great product to use when you're planting, or even when you're wanting to spread water and fertilizer on top of your side dress on your plants. It helps a lot. You can use the compost that's left over by raking it into your garden. A little history. 2,000 years ago, we can see that composting was first mentioned, and that other writers like William Shakespeare and Francis Bacon also talked about using compost. So it's not a new idea. We know that, right? Who popularized composting? Well, many people did, but organic gardeners and farmers have learned how to restore nutrients into the soil. These are a couple books from my library, How to Grow Vegetables and Fruits with the Organic Method in 1961. And this Organic Garden magazine is from 1967. I saved it. What's interesting about this particular book is you can go in and he's got a couple pages where he lists the carbon to nitrogen ratio of all sorts of different items that you might use in a compost bucket. It's a very detailed book, How to Grow Vegetables and Fruits Using the Organic Method. This is for those who can't see, who are just listening. So this was J.I. Rodale, who was the father who started Rodale Incorporated in 1930, and R.D. Rodale continued his father's work for many, many years. He started in 1951, and his first publication was Rodale's Organic Gardening. So we want to sometimes speed up the natural decay process. We can use a pile. We can use a pile by just, throwing our organic materials into a bin or a pile and just leaving it. But you can speed it up using the kind of thing that I pictured at the very beginning that you guys had to watch over and over again, which is sort of a barrel. And this is one example of a composting barrel. You would just put your compost materials into the barrel, turn it when you put those materials in. And what it does is it speeds up the process by adding air. And you can always add water if your compost seems dry. The food is, of course, the nutrients that you're adding, your kitchen scraps, etc., and your brown materials like leaves and grass. And you want to increase the temperature because that speeds up the compost process. So we're going to talk about two versions. One is the hot composting, where you put all your stuff in your barrel at the same time or into your container. It brings the temperature up to 110 to 140 degrees. In theory, that stuff will turn into compost in 3 to 4 months. Cool composting is a different process. You just set a pile up, you add materials as you go, and eventually the materials in that pile will break down and you'll have compost. You can turn it. What I do with one of my leaf piles is I look at the bottom of the pile and I will find that there's a great deal of soil and material at the bottom that I can just use, push the uncomposted leaves or materials from the top, dig down at the bottom, and I've got brand new soil that I created just by leaving that pile of leaves there for a very long time. We'll talk, if we have time, a little bit about trenching or sheet or lasagna gardening, just in case anybody's interested. Who's laughing and why?
It's very.
Yeah, you don't actually compost your lasagna, just so you know. It's a process, but that's not what it is. Here's some organic materials that we talk about, and we're going to talk about what we call browns or greens or carbon or nitrogen, because those of you who've done some research on composting know that they talk about the carbon to nitrogen ratio, and they want it to be 30 to 1 or somewhere in that ballpark. But I'm going to say, who of you gardeners are going to sit and do math and figure out how to get this perfect ratio so that your carbon to nitrogen ratio turns into perfect compost? We're not going to do this. We're going to do it a sensible way and realize that the only purpose in having a perfect carbon to nitrogen ratio or a brown to green ratio, as we talk about here, is to speed up the composting process. It'll still compost. It just might take a little bit longer, or it might go a little bit faster. Carbon slows down the composting process. nitrogen and heat speed it up. So these organic materials are the carbon materials, the browns, and you saw in my composter, dried leaves and grass, dried grass. You can use straw, shredded paper, newspaper. You can add pine needles, sawdust. You can add peanut shells, anything that's dry that's already turned brown. Some of the nitrogen materials or greens that we would add, grass clippings, which the green grass clippings now, vegetable scraps, coffee grounds, blood meal, bone meal, fruit scraps, tea grounds, and tea leaves. And yes, I do put all of those things into my compost barrel. My daughter's a big tea drinker. I'm a big coffee drinker. Yes, I also throw the coffee filters in there because they are a paper product. They're going to break down eventually. And successful composting does require, and I'm going to do a quote here, the realization that no matter what you do, no matter how many mistakes you make, you are probably still going to come up with reasonably good usable compost. It doesn't matter. Number one, a basic understanding of the life forms and processes that operate within a compost pile are what we're trying to do. And that's making sure that there's air and water and browns and greens and a willingness to experiment to see what works, a little effort and a little artistry. That's from the author Stu Campbell, who wrote Let It Rot. Can you imagine what it was about? Probably composting. Here's some materials that require what we call special handling. Cardboard, corn cob stalks, diseased plants, grass clippings with chemicals. And by special handling, I mean don't use grass clippings that you've added chemicals to in your compost. They will slow it down. They might transfer those chemicals, and by I'm not worried about fertilizer, I'm worried about weed killer. What they're going to do is they're going to affect the plants that are around your compost. Hedge trimming, sometimes you have to be careful because they have scale or other materials in them. Adding lime, I will throw some lime on top of my leaf pile, but I don't put it into my compost barrel. It'll really heat things up. And it also reduces and what we call sweetens the pH by bringing it down, by bringing it up. I'm going to try to just mute everyone but me, and I'm sorry I haven't done that yet. Manage participant. Well, I can't do it. Anyway. So peat moss, nutshells, walnut and pecans. Remember that walnuts, any kind of walnut leaves, as you can see this on here, have a jugalone which restricts growth. It actually suppresses growth in and around trees and plants that particular product is involved in. Wood ash and wood chips. Rhubarb leaves have got a high have a high chemical content as well. So be careful when you think about composting them. Here's some things that you don't want to compost, and I'm going to list them and talk about why and why not to. Bones, they're not going to break down. If you can break them into smaller pieces, if you can find a way to make them decompose, go ahead and add them. Cat litter, why wouldn't you add cat litter? Number one, because they aren't compatible. Cat litter is not compatible with using compost. They can alter and damage the structure of your soil. They may have synthetic toxins in them that will leak into your garden. There are some compostable cat litters that you could use made from natural living sources, but as a general rule, do not use cat litter. Charcoal briquettes. Why wouldn't you add charcoal briquettes? Number one, they might have lighter fluid on them. And that might leak or leach into your soil. And so don't put charcoal briquette ashes into your compost pile. Cooked food waste or fatty, oily, greasy food. There is some anaerobic research into turning food waste into compost, but as a general rule, do not put leftover oily, greasy food into your compost. It will make it smell. There are a lot of other things that will happen, and it will, I'm going to say, severely damage the quality of your compost. Dishwater, well, dishwater probably has oils in it, but it probably also has Dawn or something else in there that might retard the composting process. Dairy products, same story. That's not something to add to your compost. Meat, please do not add meat to your compost. Peanut butter, it's oily. It probably won't break down. Treated yard waste, again, we talked about that once, but remember that the grass might be treated. If you've got a lawn care company, they're in the spring, they're putting crabgrass retardant. They might put other retardants like grub retardants. So those kind of things are going to damage your compost and not help it be any good. I've got sludge and biosolids in there because you may have seen and had the opportunity to buy compost that says it's biosolids. Well, that was a way that some of the marketers developed to rebrand sludge as in a positive way, as something that is sort of natural that you can add to your garden. Remember that what a biosolid or a sludge is it's really broken down sewage waste. And as you may or may not know, everything that goes into the toilet stays in the sludge. And so the biggest one that I always worry about is medications. You know, people excrete medications when they use the toilet, and those kind of things are going to stay in those biosolids. Heavy metals are going to stay in those biosolids. Don't add those to your compost. I put fish scraps on there with 2 stars because if anybody has heard of the 3 sisters, well, anyway, the Indians used to bury their fish scraps and they would plant their corn and their other products on top of the fish scraps. Well, that's good, but don't put fish scraps directly into your compost. If you're going to use those kind of products, really seriously bury them. They will break down. They will add nutrients to your soil. But what happens if you've got an open compost pile and you put fish scraps or certain things into that pile that are smelly? What you're going to attract is raccoons and other animals, and it's going to be more of an aggravation than it is a value to you to have those compost bins. So one thing you want to do if you've got a compost pile is turn it, because that adds oxygen and that helps the worms and the bugs and the microbes be happy and eating your browns and greens. And go ahead and use a pitchfork to turn that pile. What are the benefits? Number 1, it reduces the pressure on landfills and the need to find an alternative disposal method. Number 2, there's a slow release of nutrients when you use compost. It increases your organic matter. It improves the texture and structure of soils by adding that organic matter and softening up the close clay soils that so many of us are frustrated with. It increases earthworms. And we know that we do want earthworms in our soil because they also, number one, they aerate the soil, but as they excrete, that earthworm excretion really adds nutrients back into the soil. And soil treated with compost produces plants with less disease problems. So here's a couple issues you might be having with your compost pile. It smells bad. Number one, it might be too wet. It might be too tight. It might be too wet and too tight. So turn it. Get your pitchfork and turn that pile. Turn the barrel if you need to. Odors also indicate that there may be animal products in the compost pile. Not the end of the world, but it shouldn't smell. And it shouldn't smell bad. If you get that ammonia odor, there's too much nitrogen. So add yourself some carbon materials, some sawdust, some wood chips, or some straw. It's too dry because it's not decomposing. Add some water. Don't be afraid to add water to that. If it's really slow and it's cool and there's no heat in it, add some water and turn that compost. The compost is moist enough and the center's warm, but it's not hot enough to completely break down. Well, it's not big enough. It's not going to break down because it's not a big pile of compost. So add more materials if you can. Mix the old ingredients. If the pile is not small, more nitrogen may be needed. Guess what a really good source of nitrogen is? In case you didn't know, it's coffee. Once we open things back up, if anybody's been to Starbucks, they have now started a process of bagging their coffee grounds and giving them away to people to add to their gardens. So you can go into Starbucks, over in the corner, they'll have a 10-pound bag of coffee grounds that you can get. You can take that and go home, put it in your compost pile, put it on your garden. It adds nitrogen and nutrients. So the heap, here's another problem. The heap is moist, sweet, and sweet smelling, but it doesn't heat up. Again, same issue. There's not enough nitrogen or green material available. So you might want to add some fresh grass clippings. Manure is a great nitrogen source. The pile attracts animals. There are meat or grease products in the pile. They can smell it. For all food with brown material, remove any meat, cheese, or dairy. If you're gonna use those kind of products, cover them, bury them if at all possible. How are we doing on time? It is 9:34. I can do a quick talk about these different methods of composting, such as trench composting. What you want to do is dig a trench, add organic materials into this trench, and cover it with an inch of soil. If anybody's heard me talk about hugelkultur, it's a variation on that theme. You can plant your plants a couple feet away. The second time, dig a trench on the other side of the plants that you've got growing and do the same thing, compost it. Just move your plants around in the trenches. Lasagna gardening, does anybody know what that is? If you can see the picture, you see that the bottom layer is branches. The second layer is rough mulch like wood chips or leafy material. The third layer is grass clippings. The fourth layer is newspaper or cardboard. You add compost on the fifth layer above the newspaper or cardboard, and you put straw mulch on top. That's a way to have a garden that is loose, that your plants can grow right through. There's no reason why they can't. And so what do you use? Anything used in a compost pile can be used in a lasagna garden. Kitchen scraps, no meat, bone, or dairy. fruit and vegetable scraps, coffee grounds, tea leaves, weeds before they set seed, seaweed. I don't know where we're going to get seaweed around here. Shredded newspaper and pine needles. The brown materials that you might add, blooms and trimmings from the garden, grass or lawn clippings, chopped woody material, compost, aged manures, peat moss, sawdust, or hay. And I'm going to skip the process because I will share that with you. But I want to give everybody an opportunity to ask questions. So, what questions do you have? And up on the screen right now is, by the way, a pallet composter. You're all wide open. Go ahead and ask your questions.
Tricia, it's Susan. My compost pile has thousands of roly-poly bugs, which they do have their purpose, but then they're in, the garden and they eat the seedlings and they're a big problem. Is there a way to eliminate them without being detrimental to the...
Like, I guess what I would say about that is the roly-poly bugs are working very hard to break that compost down. But
They're working like crazy, but there's millions of them.
But I would say you might just want to not spread them on that part of your garden. You may want to just spread that compost on your lawn instead, because they may be just too close to the plants and the plants are too young.
Yeah.
The alternative is to put it out and bury it, spread some soil on top of it.
Well, they seem to be down in the soil too. And
No,
I've used cornmeal before, but I understand that is not good for, if you're going to seed, cornmeal is not a good thing to use.
Correct. Yeah, that's correct. And Winnie, you were going to say something. Did you have some comment you wanted to make?
No, I wasn't.
Okay.
Must have been someone else.
All right. Actually, I can tell when you guys are talking. So that's why I asked that question. So if you wanted to build a compost pile, you could get 4 pallets. Do you know what pallets are? You can get them from they're left over at the back of Porter's or other places like that. You might stack them up, use zip ties and baling wire to put them together, and that's your compost pallet creation. That's your composter. You find a way to open it up to turn the pile, and it's going to take a while, but your leaves and everything else that you're going to put in there are going to turn very quickly into compost.
Tricia, this is Becky. Could I ask a question?
Yes, you may.
I think I did something wrong. I put my 9-bark clippings in my pile that I started. I probably shouldn't have done that, right? Because they are poisonous.
I wouldn't get too worried about it, Becky.
Okay. Well,
unless that's all that's in there.
No, it's not. I put leaves and all kinds of stuff in it, but okay, I won't worry about it then. But I didn't know. I probably shouldn't do it again.
I wouldn't get too worried about it. If that was all that was in there, that would be one thing. You might just make sure that it decays really well.
Right.
They're
on the bottom of the pile, so I have to.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
And a lot of people worry about adding oak leaves because they believe that they're kind of acidic. Well, I've used oak leaves for years and they just break down. It over time, the pH balances itself. The only thing wrong with oak leaves is they don't break down very fast. And so that's one of our issues out here, because we have so much of our material, our brown material, is oak leaves. You can shred it. I tried that. It was too much trouble. But there are lots of different ways to build a compost pile. You can use chicken wire and make it round and put the stuff in the bottom. I've got a chicken wire just enough to keep it from spreading on my lawn, and I just blow the leaves over to that leafy compost pile and leave it. I don't do anything with it. A couple of years later, I dig to the bottom of it when I need some soil and some organic material. Here's another version if you're looking what you might use to build a cinder block composter. And what other questions do you guys have?
Tricia, what about onions or garlic? Have you ever had a problem with that as far as hurting the worms, killing the worms?
No, because I compost my onions significantly.
Okay.
I always throw them in there. You know, you'll find that they'll sprout a little bit, but no, I don't have much problem with that.
Tricia, what about citrus peels?
Same thing, just throw it in your composter.
Okay.
I do that all the time. My orange peels, my lemon peels go in there. Unfortunately, I don't take the seeds out, and quite often I have sprouts in my garden where I have spread compost that are lemon or apple or anything else. So if you're worried about having vague, unidentified stuff growing in your garden, you might want to keep the seeds out, throw them in the garbage disposal.
Carolyn. Oh, sorry. Ted, did you want to go? Oh, I had a
Well,
question.
I was just wondering, I've got one of those
ahead, Ted.
barrels.
Okay, Carolyn's going to talk first.
Okay.
Sorry, I'm on the telly, Ted, so she can't see when I'm
No
talking.
problem.
Have you ever used a commercial organic composter additive, Patricia? Do you see any advantage to that? I've seen that for sale, never used it.
The answer to that is it depends, because it depends on what kind of materials you're trying to compost. If you wanted to use that product, it would be to speed up the composting process. It was cool or whatever, and you wanted to make sure, but I'm going to say it's probably just a high nitrogen, high microbe product. I don't think I'd waste the money on it.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, and Ted, was that you?
Yeah, I've got a barrel composter, and would it be a good idea to try to harvest earthworms and put them in the barrel, or would that help anything, or would they survive in there?
I don't think they would survive in there, Ted.
Okay.
I because in theory, if it's doing what it's supposed to be doing, there's too much heat in there.
Okay.
The idea is once you spread it, that will create an environment for earthworms to survive. But one of the talks we should have one of these days is growing, using vermicomposting or vermicomposting. Is that the right word? Because I think it's exciting, and you could do composting all winter just by getting a bin, just one of the bins that you buy at the store to store your clothes and papers and everything like that. You shred newspaper and you throw your kitchen scraps in there, and you buy the red worms and put them in there, and they will compost the heck out of that stuff, and you'll have some really good, very nutrient rich worm compost to side dress your plants or to put on your garden or do anything. I wanted to tell you that what I do with my compost, and I mean, I compost all winter. I fill that barrel all winter. It composts slowly in the winter, of course, but I have been using this coconut coir, these compressed bricks, and you rehydrate them, okay? They don't have much for nutrients in there. All they really have is
Oh.
fiber. So I mix those half and half with my compost. And that's what I've been planting my tomatoes in and my trees and those kind of things. And it's a good way. Number one, it's inexpensive. I don't like using peat moss because of the low pH. And it's much more environmentally friendly product than peat moss, which is a limited resource.
Tricia,
Hey,
say
Trish.
again what you're talking about.
Well, it's a compressed block called coconut coir, COIR. And I bought it last year to test it. They had it at the Walmart store. And basically, if you wanted to take something home, you had the alternative of buying a block that was about 1 by 1 by 3 inches, or buying a 40-pound bag of soil mix, right? Which is easier to handle? The small block that doesn't weigh anything. So I bought several of those, experimented with them last year, and by rehydrating them in my barrel, that's the whole idea, is you rehydrate them by adding water into my wheelbarrow. They fill about 2 cubic yards of material. I add compost to them, I mix it up, and I plant everything in it. And it works out really well.
What are these bricks called?
Coconut coir, COIR, and it's basically ground up coconut shells.
Hmm.
And they compress it into a block to transport it. So it takes up a lot less space. In fact, I couldn't find several of them that I purchased, and then I remembered that they were still in the trunk of my car. And that's
Hey, Tricia, this is Sally. I just have a quick question. So I don't have a compost pile, but I want to start one. So what should I expect if I go to Porter's? A cost, or they're willing to give them away?
to do pallets.
Yes. I
Um,
think the pallets look the best on my property, or, I guess using a barrel, but
the pallet would be easy to manage, They might want $5 a piece for them, maybe, but they might just give them to you, especially
all right.
if you're a good customer.
They can be notorious sometimes for higher prices, so I just wouldn't
Yeah.
expect to give them away, but I thought I'd just ask.
We used to get them for free, but it depends, because they'll stack them up and wait for somebody to come and take them. They probably wouldn't care if you asked for them. Say, do you guys have any pallets that I could have?
Okay.
Ask,
Sounds good. Thank you.
ask for free. What else?
This is great.
It was a good presentation. Thank you, Tricia.
Awesome.
Yeah, great.
Thank you.
I think I'd want to redo it again so that it was more professional.
It was very
Oh,
professional.
Fine.
No,